Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to be here and welcome you all for the moveIT session. We have tonight 150 subscriptions for Michael's presentation, which is oriented towards strategic agile thinking. Since the start of the moveIT events in 2017, we already welcomed a lot of you, so we are really proud to see people rejoining our moveIT events. And as we see, the brand is getting more and more known in the market. We try with the moveIT, we try to bring value at your doorstep and share our experience of things which we have done in the field and where you can profit from that wealth of information. This being said, in the fall of this year, we came to the conclusion that we had a series of really strong presenters and strong presentations that won internationally awards for the presentations in the last couple of months. So we decided, why not bringing this for our home public, for you, ladies and gentlemen, and make sure that you can, from your home, follow those presentations. Today, Michael's presentation has been awarded the Best Presentation Award on the SQA Days in Moscow, and Michael closed the biggest event in France, the GFTL event in Paris. It was still a live event, do you imagine? He had the closing keynote with this presentation. This being said, Michael, some of you will undoubtedly know him, is our Learning and Development Manager at CTG, but not only that, he serves the ISTQB community as the President of the Agile Chapter. So I welcome him on stage, and I can already add to you that if you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat. We'll monitor the chat, and after the presentations, we will make sure that there is some time to answer your questions. Michael, please, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. So, hello everybody, good evening. Thank you for joining my session on strategic agile thinking, or the subtitle Agile Transition from the Trenches. The idea of this concept came from a lot of stories I heard and I've seen. Stories from our customers, stories from our own employees, where the organizations they are working for are undergoing an agile transition, moving towards another approach, or have already transformed into something agile, but that was not clearly such a success. We hear a lot of bad stories, even companies going back from their agile transition, and at least there are some hurdles that they need to take. What I want to share with you is some lessons we've learned for those companies, for those people, for those organizations, those groups that are undergoing such an agile transformation, and how you can improve and make the transformation more successful. But let's first go back to some statistics, because I'm rather statistically oriented. So I want to share with you some numbers, some agility numbers. Last year, there was a report produced by the Worldwide Software Testing Practices, and it questions with a lot of organizations, participants, employees, engineers in the field of IT, their uptake of agility. And they put their software development lifecycle into 4 different categories. That was agile, of course we all know that one. It was a sequential model, call it V model or waterfall. It was a combination of both, or something else iterative. Now I know you already think, okay, but that is something strange because iterative is also agile and whatever is incremental. I can't argue these numbers. This is just what the categories they chose. Now they questioned those people, and what were the statistics that came out of it? 79% of the correspondents said they were following an agile practice, an agile approach. 43% said, well, we follow a sequential approach. 27 a combination, and 11 something iterative. Now, you don't have to be a tester or in software quality or quality assurance to see this is more than 100%. That's logical because people could fill in multiple things. So even though some people said, okay, we work purely agile, others said, well, in fact, for some project it's agile, for some a combination. What is clear for me is that if you take the numbers from agile, the combination iterative, that a certain level of agility is there in most of the organizations. Whereas where 10 years ago sequential was the big pit boss, That's not the case anymore. So agility is there, but then why is it going wrong so many times? Well, for me, agility on itself, well, it's a picture from somebody looking in the mirror. It's unfortunately not me. I wish it was me. But agility is something like a mirror. A mirror, when you look at it when you wake up in the morning, does not make things cleaner, does not make you look prettier. It does not make you look better just by looking at it. The only thing a mirror does is to show you where your pitfalls, where your problems are, things you might be able to improve. You need to shave, you need to brush your teeth, you need to comb your hair. That is what a mirror does, and so does Agile. That mirror that Agile is, if you can't, as a team, as an organization, as a tribe, as whatever kind of way you're working in, if you can't deliver a releasable increment every sprint, what you will have is a very foggy mirror, and a foggy mirror that will hide all the challenges you are facing. It might seem from a distance to deliver some value, but you will not be able to pinpoint the details, so you will not be able to continuously improve. That is what Agile should be. It should not only be about the value or about collaboration or about certain ceremonies or a process or a sprint of 5 days or retrospectives. It should be the mirror that tells you what you can improve in your organization. Now, if Agile is such a mirror, then why isn't Agile more successful? We see that 79% of the organizations follows an Agile approach, but we hear so many rumors from the trenches where Agile is going wrong. Why are we experiencing so much resistance of people saying, no, I do not want to go for an Agile approach? What makes the Agile uptake so difficult? Or at least what makes something that looks so easy, just a simple process, no big procedures, what makes that so difficult for people to take it in and make the best out of it? I want to highlight with you 7 problems that we have and some lessons learned from that. Let's go for the first. The first problem, one you might recognize, is that we tend to start too late when it comes down to our development. If you take a look right here, you have a certain point in time on a timeline that is where the actual work starts. The project gets started, you make up some analysis, an epic, a vision, user story, acceptance criteria. This is where the work starts. And at a certain point in time, we've finished the work. You can assume from a testing perspective, then it's when you go into production, or from an IT services management standpoint, when you go about your guarantee period. The total time between the work start date and the work finish date is what we call the process time. Or maybe you know it from your organization as the cost or the full-time equivalence per man day. That is your total cost that you have for your delivery of the value you had into it. And that's an easy thing for most organizations because that is something you can measure in timesheets. You have daily timesheets, weekly timesheets. You have some cost centers where you allocate the cost of your work. However, this is not the real cost. The real cost is much bigger than this because between the time that the work started, you crystallize your idea, you got the aha-erlebnis, you got the feeling this is a good idea, there's some more time. The total time between your idea conception and the work finish date is what you call your lead time. Every minute, every hour, every day you start later is a minute you get your possible benefit later. You might say that the time between the idea conception date and the work start date doesn't cost anything because there's no FTE, there's no cost, there's no man days being spent. But if your idea is good enough, then you're missing additional revenue and the early adopters. So my idea for you here, the first takeaway is start earlier. Don't waste time between the idea conception and starting the work. Make sure you're ready to innovate on new ideas as soon as possible. The second problem, we have no idea when to stop. We are always a little bit reluctant to stop an ongoing, non-finished project. However, we should not be so afraid to abandon something, to defer or to pause an ongoing project to start a new one, or to start something intermediate, or to spike something. Let me give you an example. I love this image. It's my favorite plane of all times. It's the Concorde. Well, Concorde was a collaboration between Air France and British Airways. And even during its development, it was very clear that the development cost of the Concorde would always be higher than any potential benefit you could calculate. And nevertheless, they continue with the project. Well, why was it? Because there was some value that you could take, that you said, okay, this is too important for us, it's a prestige project. You could have said we abandon this, but they didn't, because they found it too important. Now, step aside from the Concorde, go to two different projects, Project A and Project B. A already costed 2 million and the market is declining. B is a new project with a huge potential. And then you get something that you call in psychology the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the fallacy that you don't stop an ongoing project due to the investment you already made. So what you see is people are reluctant to stop project A, even though project B might be more successful, because we already invested so much time, so much money, so much manpower in this. So we continue because it will get better. I promise the next iteration will attract more customers. That's a psychology thing and it doesn't help you. That's the same if you play poker. The money you already put on the table is money you already lost. You will not increase your chances of winning by just adding more money. That's already lost. It's better to abandon than to keep on investing. On top of that, you also have something called the innovator's dilemma. That was a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen, and it is about the profit you gain and the profit life cycle of any product or service you are developing. How does it work? Well, you see two axes here. On the x-axis you have the time, on the y-axis you have the value. What you see is that in your first iteration, you get a minimal value. You have to invest a lot of manpower and money to get some marginal revenue. Once that base is created, once you have the minimal features of your product, each iteration becomes drastically better. You keep on adding new things that people like about your product, so you get a bigger bandwidth and you get more revenue. At a certain point in time, towards the top of the curve, all the most valuable improvements are already created and the added value per new feature is very minimal. This is your typical curve of any product or service you create. Now, what happens in most organizations is you have your first product that you create, you see the margins dropping, you see the revenue dropping, and you start innovating on something new. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except if you work in finance, because what you see then is that you have a huge gap, what you see in red over there. The huge gap is the minimal profit you gain from all those additional features at a high cost, and you see the innovation that's needed, again, minimal revenue at a very high cost. The lesson that you can take from this is if you are able to boost that innovation earlier, that you start already doing the innovations not over there, but right here, then you go a bit further. Then you increase the revenue, the cash flow in your organization and makes it much more valuable, and you free up some resources. That goes together with the sunk cost fallacy. You abandon the old project, which you know that at a certain point in time will not generate revenue anymore, and you start by opening up a new cash cow for your organization. Third one is that we have trouble knowing what we want, the different doors problem. In physics, that was quite clear. Nature might help us a bit. The law of evolution predicts that the species the best equipped will further evolve. But however, the law of evolution isn't always helping us. The biggest success stories in IT come from disruption, come from innovation, and not from evolution. When you talk with people about agility and agile, you hear something coming back a lot. How can we make the right choices? Well, you have a big group of things you can create, which we can call the products. Products that you can develop as an organization. From that group of products, there's the things that give the minimal amount of features that people will attract, that are going to convince people to buy those products or services. And from that subgroup, you have a small group that will give some viability there, that will give some revenue for you. The products that are not bringing the minimum or the viability are just waste. It's not a bad thing to have waste. It's a good thing because you want to innovate. And if you want to innovate, you have to take chances and risks. So that means that there will be a lot of waste created, but you learn from that. But the goal, of course, is to create value as soon as possible. Products that are only creating the minimum are often not worth the original investment, because you will have a lot of commodity in there. Products that are viable but that don't offer the minimum are risky. So when it comes to the holy grail of development, the MVP, the minimal viable product, that is a combination of all three of them. It's a product that we can create ourselves, that delivers at least the minimal value for our customers, and which is viable for us as an organization. Now, this sounds very theoretical. I come from Belgium, and if there's one thing in Belgium that we all love, then it's French fries. Suppose that I want to step out of the IT business and I have a great business idea. And since I have the idea, I will act as the product owner, the PO for this idea. If I can create a device that can sell French fries automatically, so take away French fries from a vending machine, what do you think is the MVP, the minimal viable product of this device? You might think about it for a moment within this exercise already quite some times, and seems like we had a small hiccup there. So what I was telling is that we were about to create a vending machine for French fries. And in the past, I have asked a few people, what do you think would be a good minimal viable product for this? I got the answer, it needs to sell French fries or mayonnaise or ketchup or some snacks according to it. These are all good ideas that should come to the product backlog. But what is generating revenue for organization? That is that you need to find a way, a requirement that can get the money from the customer and holds that money. That's the first thing you need to develop, because otherwise you're going to create a product that after 1 or 2 or 3 increments will only hand out French fries for free. So you're losing money there. So first focus on the things that make you a viable organization and a viable product. The third point is that we have a problem in predicting what good quality might be. There's a great book, and I can only encourage you to read it, by Ben Linders, a book from 2017, about the drivers of quality. And Ben Linders has linked quality to the requirements. And why? Because Ben Linders thinks, and he's not alone in that, that your requirements are the basis for every product. Whether you talk about IT, or you're building a house, or you're constructing a car, or whatever that you're developing, you first need the foundations, which is some level of documentation. And of course, depending on the risk level where you work in, or the type of organization or business you are in, you need more granularity, more depth into those requirements. But at least these are the foundations. Now, when it comes down to requirement quality, what do you need? Well, according to Ben Linders, you need 2 things. You need commitment and you need stability. What do we mean with commitment and stability? Commitment means that from all the stakeholders, your developers, your analysts, your testers, your product owners, your people from services, they need to commit in working, in validating, in writing, in accepting these requirements. Your team needs to say, okay, these requirements that we've selected, we commit that we're going to create those. On the other hand, you do not want a commitment on your entire product backlog. That's too much. You can't ask for people, do you commit that you will create all of this in what I can't even give you a promise in 6 weeks. I can't promise my family what we'll do in March next year. So why should I be able to commit to a user story where I don't even know the technical details? That's impossible. So you keep your commitments very strict, but also very small. When it comes down to stability, stability is the inverse of the amount of change to a requirement. So you want your requirements to be as stable as possible. Oh, wait a second, I hear you say, because Agile and agility is about the possibility to change things. Of course, we want people to be able to change their desires, but those changes come at a cost. So people should be able to change requirements, but not once a team has committed to certain requirements. If a user story is already in development in an increment, a change should not be possible anymore, because otherwise any kind of prediction about the level of quality, about the duration, about the cost will be flawed. So we know that changes will happen, but we keep them as little as possible, only to the things we have not committed for yet. So to summarize that book, and that's great because we summarized a book of 350 pages in a few slides, we want that requirements are fixed in iteration and flexible throughout the product backlog, and we commit as little as possible. We never commit early unless you know exactly why you want to do something. That might be because you have some kind of constraint that you need to do, or some legal constraint. Of course, then you need to commit all the time. So that is qualitative, in a few words. The fifth problem, and that might seem very strange to you, is that we have no idea how to prioritize. And I can already understand that you say, well, we know how to prioritize because we use dotted voting, and we use high, medium, low, and we use big room planning, and we use all kinds of these techniques. That's right. But that doesn't take away the biggest constraint from prioritization. The biggest constraint of prioritization is, again, our psychology. I give you this nice picture of two kids and ask you one intriguing question. Which one of those do you love most? You can't answer that, because if these are your kids, you love both of them equally. At least that's what we all believe. But in IT, we ask people to choose between the two things they love the most. Which one do you prefer the most? Because you can only start on one job at a time, not on two at the same time. That doesn't work like that. So we're asking the impossible from people. In psychology, this is what you call the endowment effect. The endowment effect is a psychological effect where you attribute some value to the things that are yours, that has a certain value. Take, for example, my toothbrush. If I lack my toothbrush in the morning, for me, that's a big cost. That's a big no-no in the morning. However, the same toothbrush, exactly the same product or solution, for you has very little value, because for you, that's a very dirty toothbrush that's used by somebody else. That's what you call the endowment effect. The things you use, the things you want, the things you value, have in your mind a bigger value than others. That means that if you have a product owner that has to choose for a certain sprint or iteration backlog, what we want to take into the backlog, that's very difficult for him. We are facing some technical difficulties. We're trying to solve it. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. So I was telling you my brush. I will not bore you with that again. But if you ask your PO to choose between two different user stories, that's very difficult for him to do. If you go on a bigger scale, on a project level, on a portfolio level, then you have the same team working with multiple product owners. How can you ask these product owners as a user story, is this one more important than the other, yes or no? Human nature. We are so reluctant to change. We are so afraid of doing something different than what we're used to. That is what you call, in nice terms, your comfort zone. Well, if you remain in your comfort zone, as the slide suggests, then you will never know what is out there. The idea is that you, in Agile, that you embrace change. What you find here is a very nice developer. And what does developers say? Well, this tester should not touch my code, my precious. And that is what I hear a lot of developers saying. You can't have access to my code. And testers are complaining because, well, we can solve this easily. We have to wait 2 days now for a fix, and we can't do that. Well, please, Mr. or Mrs. Developer, give me one good reason why. Okay. So what is the reason that a tester cannot touch code? Well, that's purely because this is outside of the comfort zone of the developer. There should not be a reason not to have that. Maybe you want some validation, maybe you want some code review, but at least You can let a tester solve certain defects. My defect reports as a tester become better if I have access to the source code, if I can debug the source code, if I can highlight to the developer on which line the problem exists, and maybe if I even can suggest the change in source code that will speed. After all, the goal of a developer is to develop value, not to solve issues. If those issues can already be solved by the person that found them, you save a lot of. On the other hand, you have the same comfort zone for your testers. Testers that say that developers should not test because, well, if they test, they let everything pass. That's also not true. Developers can make very good testers, maybe on a unit test level or an API test level, and maybe not on acceptance test, but they have some value. There's nothing wrong with the developer testing. I like developers that test, ideally also in as possible. But if you stay in that comfort zone, you will never reach a good level of collaboration. That is also part of that embrace change. Now, when it comes down to that psychology, people think that change is a process with certain group dynamics. That for any change, people think that you need a majority. Well, unlikely to what you think, change or changing things is not a constitutional or a democratic process. You do not need a 50% or 50% plus one majority. Let me give you the result of a study. Science published in 2018 a study that studied the behavior, the beliefs and the preference of a group, and they investigated that they do not require an absolute majority. The image you have right there is a group of 24 persons. Let's call it . So you want to convince your board of directors to implement a new approach, whether it be safe scaled agile framework or Spotify model or less or Nexus or whatever you want to bring to them. You might think that if you want to convince this board of 24 persons, that you need to convince at least 12 or 13 of them or even more. Well, group psychology and group dynamics tell you differently. If you can already convince 25% of them, 6 people, that this is a good idea, the rest, those 6 people become the ambassadors of your idea. And that's the same for any idea you have in your organization. You never need to convince your entire group. If you can convince a small group of people of a good idea that will try the idea, invest in the idea, and become the ambassador of that idea, then you will roll it out. If you wait until you have a majority, then it's too late. Then the project will run out and your innovative idea will not be so innovative anymore. The final problem I'd like to address, except from network problems, is that we tend to start too big. You see the pile of papers over there, and that is what I face and what I see in a lot of organizations. They have so much work on the shelf, they have no idea where and when to start. When we go back to physics, there's something that's called Little's Law. And what is Little's Law? Well, if you put it in a formula, it says L equals A and W. Doesn't say a lot, does it? Well, L is the number or the current number of items in a collection. A is the arrival rate of any new items to that collection. And W is the average time to process to work on an item. If you apply some simple mathematics, the formula becomes W equals L divided by A. Now let's make it a little bit more logical for you, a little more graphical. You have a container with a fluid in it. L is the liters of fluid you have in that container. A is the rate in which the fluid flows into the container, which is the same as the fluid leaving the container itself. So if you calculate this, you see that L, in this case, the content of the container is 100 liters. A, the rate that new fluid arrives in the container is 20 liters per minute. Then you can calculate W. W is 100 liters divided by 20 liters per minute, means it takes 5 minutes on average to process any given liter of water or fluid inside the container. So in general, you can say that if you could distinctively color 1 drop of water in it, on average, it would take 5 minutes from the moment it enters the container until it leaves the container. Now, if you play a little bit with these numbers, let's say you increase the volume of water in the containers from 100 liters to 200 liters, you see that the average time to process 1 liter of water increases with the same level. That's because of the formula. If you take 200 liters of water and your flow becomes 20 liters per minute, then the average time you need to process the same amount of water is 10 minutes. That's pure physics. Now, does this apply in software? Yes, it does. Let's translate these terms. If you take the same formula and you translate it in work in process, or what you can call your product backlog size, that equals your average throughput, or in agile terms, your velocity, the amount of work you can do in an iteration, and you multiply it by the lead time. You have the same formula. If you apply the same mathematical truth, then you can calculate your lead time, the time between your idea conception, when it has been put into the backlog, and the moment it gets released into production. Your lead time can be calculated by dividing your backlog size by your throughput or your velocity. Same story right here. Suppose you have a backlog that contains 500 story points. Whether you use story points or any other term doesn't really matter. You know your velocity, your team's velocity. You can release 100 story points per day at the end of an iteration. That means that if you make the same calculation following the formula, it takes on average 5 days to release 1 story point. That means that if you have an idea about your total product backlog, you have a projection, an extrapolation, when you can go into production with the full backlog known and unchangeable at that moment. Now, if you add stories, if you keep on adding stories to a backlog, if a team begins with a big backlog, let's say 1500 story points, then you see that your average time for any given user story multiplies with a value of 3. So the biggest lesson to learn here is that, especially when you want to keep a team agile, if you want to develop value as soon as possible, to keep the product backlog as small as possible. Don't there where you know that for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 months, they will not be developed, that they generate marginal value. Don't start it because you lose a lot of attention to your team. You keep on going over these stories, you keep on discussing on these stories, which is not delivering value to your team. Now, Little's Law, what does it mean to you? What do you want to do? What is what you want to achieve with your team? Is your goal to increase the velocity of your team? Well, then there's only one answer. You have to limit the velocity. So if you want your team to deliver more value, limit the working process that you have. If you want to reduce the lead time, if you want to deliver value faster to your customers, if you want to generate money quicker, also only one solution, also limit the product backlog size. And then there's one more thing, because it doesn't stop right there at Little's Law. There's also the concept of context switching. Context switching is a very nice phenomenon that if you're focused on one task and something pops up, an email, a Slack message, a Teams message, a telephone, somebody that walks into the office and taps you on the shoulder to ask an intriguing question, at that point in time, you lose your focus. You answer that question, you answer that mail, you switch the song, you do whatever you want, you put a postman out of the door, you take the package, whatever you think that switch your context. On average, it takes more than 50 minutes to go back to the zone where you were in. At least when you were doing not some repetitive task, but a task that requires some thought processes. That's a lot of time lost. That also applies to your backlog. The more content you have in your backlog, the more small stories you put in there, where people have to switch. Wait, we need to solve this defect also, and we need to do documentation for this also, and this and this and this. The more context switching you will have, and the more wasted time you will have also. Try to avoid this. So I think we're almost there. What are the takeaways that I want you to have for tonight? Well, I'll summarize what I've said very shortly for those that stood by the interruptions. First problem is that we start too late. So try to bring your idea conception date sooner to your work start date, and then means you will start making revenue sooner. The second one, that we don't know when to stop, when it's a very costly project, if there's not much revenue, If you see your revenue dropping, think about the innovator's dilemma, think about the Concorde, think about poker. Just stop with it and start a new project, start innovating there. If you have no idea what you want, try to make the right choices, try to prioritize in the correct way, try to make sure that you have the right things set in place for you. If you want to have an idea about the quality your customers want, the first thing you need to tackle is your user stories, your requirements. Think about collaborative user story writing. So 2 people writing the story at the same time, or even 3 people. That is much more cost friendly than having people writing stories and afterwards reviewing them. The prioritization issues. You know that you cannot ask people to choose, so put them on a table where one is more important than the other. The reluctancy for change. Remember that you do not need a majority or a democratic vote for that. That if you can convince 25% of the people that is enough to start with a great idea and to become innovative, and that change, innovation and success does not come by thinking about risk, but thinking about change. And the last one is that we start too big, so we need to limit the amount of user stories in our product backlog and grow a steady backlog. While stories are removed from the backlog, we can add to it, but don't let it grow too much, certainly not in the beginning. This was my story. I hope you enjoyed it, and sorry for the inconvenience of the technical constraints we had.